have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
So I remember when I was younger, teenager, I got interested in communism. And the reason I got interested in communism was because people were always telling me that everything that I had just kind of thought of was communism. I'd say, why don't people just have health care guaranteed? Just like, we have roads, why don't we have health care? Can't do that, it's communism. And I thought, okay, why don't we organize the, no, can't do that, it's communism. And why was communism bad? And they said, well, communism's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Everywhere anyone's ever tried to have communism, it's just led to mass starvation and death and a brutal dictatorship, and it's just completely failed. It's never had any economic success. It just doesn't work. Thought, okay, and I learned that, Stalin killed a gajillion million people, and Fidel Castro killed even more, and Mao killed even more than that, and it was just, you can't have communism. But I was fascinated by the idea that maybe we could have a more rational society. So I went to the public library, and I got a book by Leon Trotsky, because I thought, Trotsky, Stalin killed him, right? So he's somebody who maybe he could figure out, he could teach me a way that communism might be good and not like this bad communism that we've heard about. And there was a book by Leon Trotsky that had a name, The Revolution Betrayed. And I thought, that's the book I'm going to read, because it says, The Revolution Betrayed. It's going to tell me how his communism is different than the other kind. So I opened Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed. And the first chapter was called, What Has Been Achieved? And I read it, and I was blown away. And I thought, this can't be true, because that entire chapter is nothing but statistics about how much wheat was being grown, about how many tractors was being grown, about how much steel was being grown, about how the standard of living in Russia at the time and the surrounding countries, the Soviet Union, was rising. And page after page, I'm reading all these numbers, and I'm saying, wait a second, I've been told that communism completely failed. I've been told that no socialist country had ever raised living standards. I'd been told that economically socialism doesn't work. I said, this can't be true. So back in the day, there was this thing called an encyclopedia. I don't know if people have ever heard of that, but there was this thing called the World Book Encyclopedia. So I went to another part of the library, and I got the World Book Encyclopedia in the section on the Soviet Union. And I turned to the section on economy. And what I found was about 2 paragraphs that said, the Soviet Union has substantially increased living standards. They've industrialized the country. They've built a modern education system. And of course, it's only 2 paragraphs, and the rest is about, famines and hardship. And I thought, wait a second, there's a problem here. There's a concept. If you read Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, The Fascist Rant, he talks about the concept of a big lie, and how when you lie and you lie big, people are more likely to believe it because they just can't comprehend it. Everyone tells a little white lie here and there. But when you tell a big lie, and that big lie is everywhere, and it's just being promoted, and it's a really big lie, people are more likely to believe it because they just can't comprehend it not being true. And the idea that communism has never worked anywhere, it's never had any success, it's never achieved anything, is the big lie of our time. It's the myth of the 20th century. And it is hanging over all of our heads. If we cannot refute it, we have nothing. Amen. In the United States, when people go to you and you say, you advocate socialism or communism, they say, well, everywhere that's ever been achieved, it's completely failed. That's simply not true. 1928 to 1938, you had the 5-year plans and the industrialization of the Soviet Union. The rate of electrification increased 10 times. They had 10 times as much electricity. The coal production multiplied by 3 times. They built 20 new tramway systems, 80 new bus systems, and hospital beds in rural areas doubled. The USSR at that point had the largest tractor industry in the world. and the largest steel industry in the world. No country in the world, not the United States, not Britain, not China, no country in the world was producing more tractors and more steel than the Soviet Union. They were also the top locomotive producing country in the world during this time, during the 1930s. And keep in mind, at that point, the rest of the world was having a Great Depression. The Great Depression was happening in the rest of the world. Louis Fisher, who wrote for The Nation, he said, "The Soviet frontier is like a charmed circle which the world economic crisis cannot cross. While banks crash, while production falls and trade languishes abroad, the Soviet Union continues in an orgy of construction and national development. The scale and speed of its progress are unprecedented." There's a PBS documentary called Red Flag 1917, and for that documentary they interviewed Tatiana Fedorova, and the full transcript of her complete interview is actually on the PBS website. They only put a snippet of a few things she said.
Fyodorova was held up as an example to others.
We live so well. Our hearts are so joyful. In no other country are there such happy young people as us. We're the happiest young people. And on behalf of all young people, I want to thank our party and our dear comrade Stalin for this joy that we have. Stalin set a task. Build this or build that. And thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, this was a country where people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch-bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. How was it possible, at one of the most difficult times, to raise these great construction sites? It was only possible through the unity of the people and the love of the people for their idol. Because for us, Stalin was an idol.
Teams of young activists were sent to the country.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
Просто-напросто была огромная.
For Valentina Mikova and Mikhail Arkhipov, these were the most fulfilling days of their lives.
На строительстве домен был один экскаватор. И то плохой.
There was one excavator at the blast furnace building site, and it wasn't always reliable. So we dug all the foundations by hand.
Понимаете, копошатся люди.
The trench would be teeming with people. One takes the earth, throws it to the level above. The second person throws it to the third to the fourth, up to 5 or 6 levels. That was how we got the earth out of the trench. Then it was taken away in wheelbarrows.
We worked in such a friendly way. It was such a good time. There wasn't so much to eat. We weren't well dressed. We were simply very happy. Happy because we were making our personal contribution. And they asked her about what was her proudest moment. And she said it was when the first train went by. It was when the noise of the motor of the first train went by in this clean tunnel, which we had until then only seen ordinary little carriages. You can't compare that feeling to anything. The construction workers who felt that will feel it forever. No one was forced to do it. We didn't have to do it, but everyone wanted to do it. It was very hard to explain, but it was the time of enthusiasts. At the time, it was said that communism is the young people of the world, and we were the young people of those years. Each of us tried to build a foundation of the structures with great joy. It was like a happy song. Many countries repeated this process. Romania, for example. This is a great source, right? I always joke that there's two media types in the United States. There's the media that's meant for like mass consumption to tell us what to think. And then there's like the media that the capitalists actually use to like make their business calculations and decisions. And if you want a good source on the history of socialist construction and its successes, I would encourage you to check out the Library of Congress, U.S. Library of Congress Country Studies. For example, Romania was a socialist country. Between 1950 and 1971, the number of hospital beds per 1,000 people in Romania more than doubled. The number of doctors per 1,000 people increased by 25%. The infant mortality rate was reduced by more than 75%. In 1945, only 27% of people were able to read and write in Romania. By 1966, according to the U.S. Library of Congress, illiteracy had been eradicated in Romania. By 1970, the number of teachers... By 1970, the number of teachers had tripled, and the number of university professors in Romania had gone from only 2,000 before World War II to 13,000. How can people say this is not progress, right? Again, North Korea, a country study by the U.S. Library of Congress. We're constantly told about the hardship that North Korea has had recently since the fall of the Soviet Union. Between 1948 and 1990, the life expectancy of the average person in North Korea increased by 30 years. 30 years. Yeah. In 1955, North Korea only had 285 hospitals in the whole country. By 1986, it had 2,401 hospitals. Talk about economic progress. Illiteracy was wiped out. Universal compulsory education was created. And I just want to read you what was said. This is actually from a BBC News article published in August of 2008. It says, at one time, North Korea's centrally planned economy seemed to work well. Indeed, in the initial years after the creation of North Korea, following World War II, with spectacular results. The mass mobilization of the population, along with Soviet and Chinese technical assistance and financial aid, resulted in an annual economic growth rate to have achieved 20, even 30% in the years following the devastating Korean War. As late as the 1970s, North Korea languished in the shadow of the economic miracle over the border. So there you go. And it's other countries that have moved towards socialism. In Syria, for example, between 1970 and 2009, the life expectancy in Syria increased by 17 years. During this time, the infant mortality rate decreased from 132 deaths per 1,000 live births to 17.9. And that's according to the Avincia Journal of Medicine. The U.S. Library of Congress wrote about the fact that they had achieved full primary school enrollment. In 1981, 42% of Syria's adult population was illiterate. By 1991, they had completely wiped out illiteracy. And they talk about the Soviet Union. They built, hydroelectric power plants there. Cuba is a great example of socialist planning having successes. This is the Guardian newspaper. They wrote, Cuba's literacy rate is at 100%, and life expectancy parallels first world nations despite limited funding and supplies. The life expectancy of Cuba is 81 years of age, which is the highest in the region. Ban Ki-moon said that Cuba's medical school is the most advanced in the world. Just for the fun of it here, I thought I would go over some of the great things that socialism built. I was taught that socialism never built anything. It just doesn't work. Let's talk about a couple things that have been built by socialism. The world's largest irrigation system was built in Libya. The Great Man-Made River was built, the largest irrigation system in the entire world. In the Soviet Union in 1931, they built the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Dnieper Dam. At that point, it was the largest hydroelectrical power plant in the world. In the Middle East, the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the whole Middle East is called the Aswan Dam, and it's located in Egypt. And it was a joint project between Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist leader of Egypt, and the Soviet Union that brought full electrification to Egypt. Right? The longest and highest elevated road in the world is the China-Pakistan Friendship Highway that was built by Mao Zedong in coordination with the Pakistan government. And it is actually laying the basis for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where there's flourishing economic growth taking place. And in fact, the largest hydroelectrical power plant in the world today is the Three Gorges Dam in China. Also, who invented space travel? Yeah. Yeah. Also, who invented the AK-47 rifle? Yeah. Where was the first cell phone patented in 1957? Yeah. So I'm curious how anyone can say that socialism failed. I'm just curious where this notion comes from, that socialism just didn't succeed, it just didn't work. Some things are true and some things are not. And this notion that socialism failed, socialism made Russia and China into economic superpowers. Socialism raised millions of people out of poverty. Socialism wiped out illiteracy. There's not a corner of the world you can't point to and see the economic benefit of socialism. Meanwhile, capitalism is keeping people in poverty all over the world and destroying nations. And in fact, any good economist will tell you that the greatest period of economic expansion in human history is the post-World War II economic expansion, right? After World War II, from 1951 to 1973, never at any other point in human history has there been that much uninterrupted economic growth. And what was happening at that time? Well, the Soviet Union and China and Eastern Europe and Cuba and some other countries were adopting socialism and industrializing and raising their people out of poverty. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, you had the social democratic welfare states. Because communism was so popular coming out of World War II, because communists had led the anti-fascist resistance, because the Communist Party of France and the Communist Party of Italy and the Communist Party of Germany and the Communist Party in many countries was growing rapidly, the capitalists in Western Europe were forced to create huge social democratic welfare states. So you had the social democratic welfare states of Europe. And in the developing world, in the countries that were not already moving towards socialism, you had the rise of military juntas and Bonapartist regimes like Park Chung-hee in South Korea, like the Shah of Iran, and these very heavily state-controlled economies were also seeing rapid economic growth. So this idea that the free market is necessary to create economic growth is absolutely ridiculous. In fact, the period of uninterrupted economic expansion is probably the period where there was the least free market activity in the history of capitalism. So libertarians simply don't know what they're talking about. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the creation of the Third International, right? The Communist International, or Comintern, right? Karl Marx had formed the International Working Men's Association, and that had collapsed due to fighting between Marx and the anarchists. And then you had the Second International, which were the social democratic parties that had supported World War I, and it had been dissolved after World War I. Those were the social democratic parties. And really, the Second International is still around. It's called the Socialist International. DSA has a relationship with it. I don't think they're a member of it, but the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party, they're the Second International. You don't have to write this stuff down. But after the Russian Revolution, after the Bolshevik Revolution, keep third, okay, all right, it's okay. You're doing great. After the Bolshevik Revolution, they created the Third International, and it was the Communist International. And any party that accepted Lenin's 21 points for admission could join the Third International. And so the Third International went through several periods, which we should talk about. At first, it was necessary to fight against ultra-leftism. Many of the people around the world that had been supporters of the Bolsheviks and Marxism, many of them had basically supported the Bolsheviks because they had a violent revolution, and for no other reason. They thought, hey, they had a violent revolution, we want a violent revolution, we like the Bolsheviks. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks had to orient their supporters to vote, to run candidates for office, to work in unions that were not controlled by communists, and to not isolate themselves from the workers. And Lenin had to orient the parties that basically you never want to put any barricade, any unnecessary barricade between yourself and the working class. In most Western capitalist societies, a lot of people only think about politics at the time of elections. So for communists to boycott the elections would be a pretty stupid thing to do, because that would be the only opportunity you get to reach people, right? If there's an election, people are going to think about communists. So if you can get a communist on the ballot, like Chris Hillelli, you should do it, right? And furthermore, at the time in Britain, the Labour Party was being attacked. They were being accused of being radicals and extremists. So Lenin said, even though the Labour Party was a reformist sellout party, in order to show solidarity with the workers who supported the Labour Party and were seeing it being attacked and crazy red baiting, that it would be necessary to vote for the Labour Party and support the Labour Party at that point. But he said they would be supporting the Labour Party much like a noose supports a hanged man. They would vote for the Labour Party to destroy the Labour Party, and that sometimes you have to be strategic, right? And so that was the fight against ultra-leftism. And then the next point from 1922 to 1927, you had the United Front. You had the period of establishing and debating the concept of the United Front. Lenin was orienting the communists, and Lenin and afterwards the Communist International, was orienting them to say that they needed to be the leaders of a broad coalition. At that point, you had a lot of social democratic parties, you had a lot of anarchist groups, but that communists should be the leaders of a united front around demands that all three groups could agree to. You know, whether it was a strike for the 8-hour workday, whether it was a national day of protest, whether it was the freeing of political prisoners, the communists should lead the united front. And during this period, you had the rise of the right opposition of Bukharin, and you had the left opposition of Trotsky, and there was a fight over how they should move forward. In China, the United Front meant supporting the KMT and supporting Chiang Kai-shek and supporting Dr. Sun Yat-sen. In the United States, the United Front, you know, it took the form of trying to go into the American Federation of Labor and organize within it, and organizing garment workers in New York City, and supporting miners in Kentucky and in West Virginia and places like that. That was the United Front. And then number three, you have the third period. In response to the communists trying to form the United Front, you had the Social Democrats go into an anti-communist frenzy. The slogan they used was, they said, "Our main enemy is on the left." And they went into an anti-communist frenzy. The American Federation of Labor banned any communist from joining an AFL-affiliated union. The Socialist Party of the United States published endless attacks on the Soviet Union. Their argument was, well, the reason that we haven't had socialism is because the evil Soviet Union is so bad. So the communists, in the third period, they launched, you can write this below that, the United Front from below. The idea was that because the Social Democrats were in an anti-communist frenzy, because the Social Democrats were, in some places like Germany, murdering communists, that it was necessary to form a united front from below and not try to recruit the leaders of the Social Democratic groups to a united front, but instead to recruit the membership and to expose the Social Democrats. And during this period, you have the accusation, they refer to Social Democrats as social fascists in some cases, saying they preach socialism, but they practice fascism. Do I have to sing the rhyme? I have to sing the rhyme. Yes. Right. Yes, I was taught by a communist who went to that, you know, the same communist who was up at Wochika camp. She taught me the nursery rhyme. She was taught during the third period when she was a small child. It was about the Cloak Makers Union of New York City. It was the Cloak Makers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union by the bosses. Those right-wing cloak makers, they are socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hill quits Dubinsky's and the Thomases. They're making the workers false promises. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. One more time, everybody, right? Right, we're ready? All together now. The Cloak Makers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union by the bosses. Those right-wing cloak makers, they are socialist fakers who play upon the workers' double crosses. The Hill quits Dubinsky's and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Hoo-ha! And of course, you know, and you can well, we should talk about one more thing, right? So then after that, you had the Popular Front. And that was due to the fact that Hitler had taken power in Germany and that Mussolini was in power in Italy and that there was a big divide in the capitalist class. A lot of the industrial capitalists who didn't like labor unions were supporting fascism because fascism meant an authoritarian military state that would crush all labor unions. That was good for industrialists, right? They could manufacture lots of weapons. They didn't have any strikes and protests. However, it wasn't so good for international like oil monopolies like the Rockefellers and others because it meant these countries not paying back their debts as Germany did and such. So there was a divide in the ruling class over the question of fascism. And of course, the communists faced outright extermination if fascism came to power. Fascism is oppositional and opposed to everything communists stand for. So even though during this period communists were fighting the Social Democrats, during the Popular Front, they did the opposite. They formed a united front, or a popular front, with the Social Democrats, and not just with the Social Democrats, but with even capitalists who opposed fascism, because fascism was the main threat. And this is the trajectory of the Communist International, and this is how it evolved. Now, during the Second World War, the Communist International was ultimately dissolved. And Mao argued that when the Comintern dissolved, that was actually a good thing, he said, because at that point, the communist parties around the world had developed to the point that they really didn't need to be directed that carefully from Moscow. And the fact that communist parties were, at one point, gathering every year for these gatherings in Moscow was not particularly helpful. It made them look like they were foreign agents or traitors to the country or something like that, right? And so by dissolving the Communist International, that was a step forward, and it was a way to establish the autonomy of different communist parties. But the greatest expression of the Communist International in the United States was, of course, the Communist Party USA. So you can erase that and start writing again. The Communist Party of the United States was formed, and it was the American wing of the Communist International. So the CPUSA, I think there's members of that party in this room, right? And I think all of us in this room, while we may not be a member of that party's current incarnation, all of us consider that to be our heritage. That's who we come from. We are the inheritors of that country, of that party's legacy. The Center for Political Innovation maintains that party's history. Different organizations, whatever, but this is who we come from. This is us. This is us. Yeah. Now, when the Great Depression happened, the Communist Party formed unemployment councils. And it was organizations of hungry people who were unemployed, and they would go and protest demanding the right to eat. And they would break into government buildings and demand that elected officials give work or wages now. And they had huge hunger marches in Washington, D.C., huge hunger marches in major cities. 1932, in Detroit, near the mansion of Henry Ford, communists assembled and were mowed down by security guards and killed, protesting for the rights of the unemployed. You also had the bonus army. And that was the Communist Party organized veterans to demand the payment of veterans' benefits and occupy Washington, D.C., set up tents on the National Mall. And the military was eventually called in to clear them out. And it was the very famous incident in 1931.
Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me. This is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865. And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States. The orders of the President must be obeyed. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
Now, because the Social Democrats were not allowing the communists to be part of the American Federation of Labor, they formed their own labor coalition called the Trade Union Unity League, the TUUL. With the TUUL, they were able to organize the unorganized. They organized coal miners. They organized sharecroppers in the South, textile workers. These were communist unions. The TUUL, there were 10 points of unity for the Trade Union Unity League. One of the points was defense of the Soviet Union, and another point was the establishment of socialism in the United States. These were communist-controlled unions. In 1934, you had the strike wave. So in 1934, the summer of 1934, the Great Depression is on. Roosevelt is president. And in San Francisco, the dock workers went on strike. And previously, when the dock workers would go on strike, the dock workers had a racist union that was whites only. And so when the dock workers would go on strike, the white dock workers would go on strike, black workers would be hired as replacement labor, and that was that. But it was different because the Communist Party was anti-racist. And the Communist Party went to the black churches, and it went to the black community, and it said, one of the demands of our strike is going to be the hiring of black workers on the docks. And so in 1934, when Samuel Darcy, some other leaders of the Communist Party, they called the 1934 strike. And when that happened, the black community supported it and mobilized to support it. And the Teamsters supported it. And they shut down the docks of San Francisco. And that's a huge part of the imports to the United States. Ships were not being unloaded. And it caused a national crisis. And ultimately, the bosses were forced to surrender and recognize the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU, which is still today one of the most radical unions in the country, created by the Communist Party. Yeah, with their anti-racist policy, because they got away from the whites-only policy. Now, also that summer, you had the Minneapolis Teamster strike, right? A broken clock is right twice a day. The Trotskyites did one good thing, and they did the 1934 Teamster strike, and they shut down Minneapolis, right? Yeah, so there you go. And also, in addition to that, you had in Toledo, Ohio, you had the Auto Light strike that was members of a group called the Workers' Party of America, as well as the Communist Party USA. They shut down Toledo, Ohio. In the summer of 1934, they declared a national state of emergency in the state of South Carolina because the textile strike was going on and the sharecroppers were on strike as well, and the National Guard was called out in South Carolina. So it was a summer of chaos in 1934, and the country was on edge of revolt. Roosevelt was very much fearing a military coup against him, and he needed to have folks support. He needed to calm people down. So in 1935, you can write this down, 1935, they passed the Wagner Act, which legalized labor unions. So it's really because of the hard work the Communist Party did that the labor unions are even legal in this country. So they passed the Wagner Act in 1935, and the Wagner Act made it legal to be a member of a union. And the AFL was the main labor federation. But the AFL did not want to organize industrial workers, right? They had this policy. They only organized skilled workers. They were very reluctant to organize industrial workers. But there was a man who was a member of the AFL, John L. Lewis, leader of the miners' union. And John L. Lewis, 1936, he was at a convention of the AFL, and he was arguing that they should organize industrial workers, and the head of the carpenters' union did not agree with him and insulted him, called him a nasty name, so he punched him in the face. And then he led the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, to walk out of the AFL convention and form a new labor coalition called the CIO. But what made the CIO different than the AFL was first that they wanted to organize industrial workers. Second, though, they had no ban on communists, and they hired almost exclusively Communist Party organizers to organize the CIO. So you can write 1936 CIO. And the CIO, the Congress for Industrial Organizations, it had no ban on communists, and they, starting in Akron, Ohio, started a policy of engaging in what they called sit-down strikes. Normally when there's a strike, workers are outside with signs, etc. Well, the CIO had a different policy, and they occupied the factories. They sat down. They seized the machinery. It was a sit-down strike. And the most famous sit-down strike started in late December of 1936 to 1937. It was the Flint sit-down strike. And John L. Lewis, these workers in this plant, this auto plant, had seized their factory. And the National Guard was assembling, and the military was there, and the police were there. And workers from all over the country drove to Flint, Michigan to support the sit-down strikers and to support them. And John L. Lewis, who had punched the head of the Carpenters Union recently, he showed up at the factory and he ripped his shirt open. He said, "If they're going to shoot anybody, they're going to shoot me," right? And thousands of people poured into Flint, Michigan to support it. And ultimately, the military was sent in by Roosevelt, and people were shocked when they saw that the machine guns were pointed away from the factory. The machine guns were there to support the workers. And the Roosevelt administration argued that workers had the right to occupy their factories, right? At this point, there was a divide in the ruling class, and Roosevelt was under attack from the threat of fascism, so that forced him to enter a strategic alliance with the working class, right? This is how the contradictions work. This is what Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. When the capitalists are fighting with each other, it creates an opening for the workers. So 1936, you had the sit-down strike wave, right? Now, at this point, I think you can erase this. The most important contribution, and we should make no bones about this, the most important contribution of the Communist Party to the United States, by far, is their efforts to combat racism. The impact of the Communist Party of the United States in fighting racism and forcing the issue of racism to be in the discussion in the United States is massive. This is William L. Patterson. Yeah. 1951. He wrote a document called "We Charge Genocide," accusing the U.S. government of committing genocide against black people in the United States. He wrote that document, and the Soviet Union presented it to the United Nations. It's utterly amazing. The Scottsboro 9. Have people heard of the Scottsboro case? Yeah. Yes. Another great example. Do people know who this is? This is Angelo Herndon. Angelo Herndon was a black organizer for the Communist Party, in Alabama. He was organizing unemployment relief, black workers and white workers to fight for their rights. And they charged him with the crime of inciting black insurrection. And they sentenced him to death. That was a death penalty offense. As he was sentenced to death, he was facing the electric chair for passing out leaflets, right? Because inciting black insurrection. So all across the country and all across the world, people organized to support Angelo Herndon. And finally, in 1937, the Supreme Court freed him. And they freed him. And Angelo Herndon he was facing death for organizing, but he wrote a very beautiful, very, very beautiful pamphlet called "You Cannot Kill the Working Class," about the struggle to free him and how he became a communist. And there's a beautiful section from it that I would like us to read as a group. So I think everyone just read a paragraph and pass it to the next person. Take the mic and read it, and we'll read it, and then that's the end of this section. So we can discuss it. Because the Communist Party's approach to the question of race was very different than the approach we're getting now with identity politics. Go ahead, just read one paragraph and then pass it to the next person.
From the cradle onward, the Southern white boy and girl are told that they are better than black people. Their birth certificates are tagged white. They sit in white schools, play in white parks, and live on white streets. They pray in white churches, and when they die, they are buried in white cemeteries. Everywhere before them are signs for white, for colored. They are taught that black people are thieves and murderers and rapists.
I remember especially one white worker, a carpenter, who was one of the first people I talked to in Atlanta. He was very friendly to me. He came to me one day and said that he agreed with the program, but something was holding him back from joining the Unemployment Council.
"What's that, Jim?" I asked. Really, though, I didn't have to ask. I knew the South and I could guess. "Well, I just don't figure that white folks and black folks should mix together," he said. "It won't never do to organize them in one body."
I said, "Look here, Jim. You know what? The carpenters and all the other workers get a darn sight less pay for the same work in the South than they do in other parts. Did you ever figure out why?" He hadn't.
"Well," I said, "I'll tell you why. It's because the bosses have got us all split up down here. We Southern workers are as good fighters as there are anywhere, and yet we haven't been able to get equal wages with the workers in other places, and we haven't gotten any rights to speak of. That's because we've been divided. When the whites go out on strike, the bosses call in the black people to scab. When the black people strike, the bosses call in the whites to scab."
Did you ever figure out why the unions here are so weak? It's because the whites don't want to organize with the black people, and the black people don't trust the whites.
We haven't got the simplest human rights down here. We're not allowed to organize, and we're not allowed to hold our meetings except in secret. We can't vote, most of us, because the bosses are so anxious to keep the black people from voting that they make laws that take this right away from the white workers too.
We Southern workers are like a house that's divided against itself. We're like an army that goes out to fight the enemy and stops in the way because its men are all fighting each other.
"Take this relief business now," I said. "The commissioners tell the whites that they can't give them any more relief because they have to feed so many black people, and the black people ought to be chased back to the farms. Then they turn around and tell the black people that..." Okay, this is a little typo here.
Okay.
"Then they turn around and tell the black people off and get us scrapping with each other."
Now suppose the white unemployed and the black unemployed all go to the commissioners together and say, "We're all starving, we're all in need. We've decided to get together into one strong, powerful organization to make you come across with relief."
Don't you think that'll bring results, Jim? I asked him. Don't you see how foolish it is to go into the fight with half an army when we could have a whole one? Don't you think that an empty belly is a pretty punk exchange for the honor of being called a superior race? And can't you realize that as long as one foot is chained to the ground, the other can't travel very far?
Jim didn't say anything more that day. I guess he went home and thought it over. He came back about a week later and invited me to his house. It was the first time he'd ever had a black person in the house, and as a friend and equal. When I got there, I found 2 other black workers that Jim had brought into the Unemployment Council.
About a month later, Jim beat up a rent collector who was boarding up the house. The house of an evicted black worker. Then he went to work and organized a committee of whites and black to see the mayor about the case. Today, it's the black worker across town. Tomorrow, it'll be me, Jim told the mayor.
There are a lot of Jims today all over the South.
There's a book that is required reading in many U.S. schools, and it's called To Kill a Mockingbird. Have folks ever heard of this book?
Yes.
Well, it's a well-written story. It's nice and touching, but it's also liberal bullshit, right? Because at the end, the way the book portrays it is that, the black people are portrayed as just kind of inferior, helpless victims who can't possibly fight for their own rights. The white people are portrayed as, the poor white people are these dangerous, racist rednecks. And the hero is a wealthy white lawyer who just has a heart of gold and holds back the ruthless whites to protect the poor, innocent black people. And the book takes place in the 1930s. But what it's really about is the mindset of the liberals and Democrats that advocated civil rights in the 1960s. But it has nothing to do with what the Communist Party did during the 1930s. They had a very different approach. It was black and white, unite and fight. And the understanding was by fighting for the rights of African Americans, the entire working class would advance. And the struggle against racism was to advance the entire working class, right? And that all workers gain by destroying racism. That was the Communist Party's approach. And that was a very different approach than what's being promoted nowadays. And so I just wanted to end this section with that kind of anecdote and Angelo Herndon's thing. So, but let me just add one thing, that the birth of the modern civil rights movement was in 1954. There was a brutal incident called the lynching of Emmett Till, right? Where Emmett Till was a young African-American man, and he was accused of whistling at a white, well, he was underage, yes, 14, I believe, right? And he was accused of whistling at a white woman. And because of that, he was brutally killed. And at his memorial, the mother allowed his body to be photographed. And it was the Soviet Union that took that picture and sent it all over the world and showed the world this picture and showed the world what the United States was really about. And it was the Soviet Union embarrassing the United States and saying, you claim you believe in democracy and freedom. Look at that. It was that forced American capitalism and the Kennedys and the northern wing of the Democratic Party to start organizing around civil rights. But before that, it had only been communist. It had been the Civil Rights Congress. It had been William L. Patterson. It had been Paul Robeson. The communists were known as the one group that would fight racism in the United States. So I come from a really small town in Ohio. And in my really small town in Ohio, we had the archives of the town's newspapers going back to the 1950s. And I will never forget my history teacher bringing me an article from my little town's newspaper from about 1950. And the article, the headline was, "Take That, Uncle Joe." And what it was that the first black family had bought a house in my town. And the article was saying, Stalin says America's racist, but look, we've allowed this black family to have a house in Orville, Ohio. And and you read the article, and it's all about how Stalin is just completely wrong because a black family has a house in Orville, Ohio. That's the role that the Communist Party and the Soviet Union played in American history. And you cannot say that that's a small role, and you cannot equate communists with fascists and the far right, as is routinely done by some phony voices out there. This is our history, this is our legacy, and we should be very proud of it. And on that note, let's have some discussion.
All right, so in the Appalachia region,
in what year was it? Like 28, 29? 21 was, I think it was 1921. Anyway, 1920s, regardless. So, yeah. Right, so there's already a big culture of uprising, of resistance. It's happening all over the world. There's positive press coverage. All of this, you got to understand that. We're in a big coal area in Appalachia, and there's, the West Virginia coal mines, I think probably was the coal capital of the United States at the time. I'm trying to think what county it was. Was it Blaine?
Harlan?
No. Yeah. Regardless of what county it was, there were miners trying to form a union. Of course, at this time it wasn't legal, as we've just learned through the Wagner Act. However, the local sheriff was defending the right to organize a union. He refused to arrest labor leaders. He refused to shut down the union. A genuinely good sheriff. And so what happened? He was killed. Yeah. He was shot. The sheriff was killed. And new now, labor leaders are being arrested, striking miners are being thrown in jail, scabs are being brought in on the trains. And so what happens? The miners like, to hell with this. They go home, they get their hunting rifles, they all meet back at the mine, and they decide, we're going to march to the Capitol, we're going to hang the governor from a sour apple tree, and we are going to have a goddamn union. Yeah. And so they start marching, and every car they meet, every train, they stop it. They stop every train that comes through. They take the munitions, the supplies. They raid other police stations. This is like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 coal miners walking to the Capitol, which would be Richmond. What's the capital of West Virginia? Charleston. Yeah, marching to Charleston to kill the governor, to hang him, have a show trial, and get their goddamn union. And so they're stopping trains, they're raiding police stations, and they're gaining more support because miners in other towns, sympathizers, whatever they may be, are saying, okay, you know what? Hell, this is pretty fucking cool. And they join in, and they keep marching. Eventually, they get up into the mountain areas of Appalachia, really deep into the mountains. President Harding is forced to call in the National Guard. And so there is a front 3 miles long in the mountain. 3 miles. One of the longest fronts, possible to maintain. That it's massive. And it just shows the sheer amount of popular support this insurrection had. And so what was the first case of aircraft bombing in the United States? That was the Battle of Blair Mountain, right? Wow. There aren't bombers, so the planes would fly over and they drop literal bombs, grenades, government, Pinkerton planes. Yeah. The biggest problem with this was the fact that it wasn't aimed at who it should. It was aimed at just specifically the owner of the coal mine. There was no ideological guidance. It wasn't, okay, the enemy is the government that is protecting. It was very misguided, and that was the issue without having any sort of leadership, any sort of strong line that united people. It fell apart very easily because it didn't know what it was attacking. And so, that's the history of Blair Mountain, and I'm pretty damn proud of it.
All right, so I got a few comments. The first one, just about socialist innovation. Well, in New York City, there's the highest subway station in the world. It's at Smith and 9th Street, and I used to take it twice a day, every day. And I found out the lowest subway station in the world was in Kiev, Ukraine, Arsenalna. So I already had plans to go to Kiev, and I went to Arsenalna, I took pictures, I'm like, look, I'm in the lowest subway station in the world, built by the Soviet Union. Plot twist, later on I found out it's the second lowest station in the world. The lowest station in the world is in Pyongyang, DPRK, and so yet to be seen. My second comment, with my work, I teach workshops on New York City tenant history movement. And throughout the 30s and the 20s, you'll always, every time I teach this class, people get so surprised that the Communist Party in New York City is all over the history. I mean, they organized like 4,000 tenants in the Bronx, beating up police. They used to, move people back in with evictions. NYCHA, which is the public housing in New York City, used to have a ban on, racial integration, no black people allowed. So what they would do is, like in these different developments, is they would have white people move in just to get the lease and then hand over the lease to black people and then move out. And so they were part of the reason why there had to be racial integration in NYCHA in the first place. And then the last comment, because we just got into talking about like the CPUSA and like their line on racial politics and all that. I remember being like 16 years old, and I'm again in New York City. I'm watching the protests against the murder of Eric Garner. I'm watching what just happened with Mike Brown. I was like 15, maybe a couple years before. This is what happened with Trayvon Martin. And so my godmother, I'm at my godmother's house. She's this Irish-American woman, my mom's best friend since my mom immigrated here. And she's married to an Italian-American guy. He's a sanitation worker. We're sitting at the table having dinner. And I'm talking about what I think, right? I'm just like, white privilege is this country is based on white supremacy, it was built on slavery and genocide. And he's an interesting character. He's not a communist, he's not a socialist, but he's like, yeah, sure, Caleb, but at the end of the day, it's really just about the rich and the poor. And I'm like, Angelo, you don't know what you're talking about. No. Yeah, maybe it has a little bit to do with that, but that's not the primary contradiction. I mean, I didn't use that word, but the primary contradiction is about white people oppressing black people. And I had to eat my words this past summer. I go see him again, and I'm like, you know what, Angelo? You might have had something going there. It's a little bit of everything.
Okay, I think you had something, Noah?
Yeah, I was gonna say that it's weird when you hear the history that the Communist Party always strove for unity of workers, and really we're the first thing together. It's just great to. I just wanted to comment that it's great to see everybody cheering when we see that, the Communist Party today still carries that line that we need to unite. And with all of the division that's caused by, ultra-lefts and liberals, the bosses, etc., I feel great being here with all of that unity. That's all.
All right.